Well, we're a long way from parity. Our results show, and this is only for the Congress and for state legislative office, that, it's important to know who's above parity. So white men in both of these categories are like 2.5, 2.1. They're overrepresented, in other words. That's what we mean by parity. White women are not over parity. They're maybe 75% of where they should be, or actually even less, I think. Black men are closer, but they're maybe 74, 75% at the congressional and the state legislative level, whereas the women are, black women are maybe 30 or 40% of where they should be. Latinos, the males are maybe 70%, but women are less than that, 30, 40%. Asian American even lower. So we've got a long way to go. It's great to see more numbers, but in terms of the proportional representation relative to their place in the population, we're a long way away. I think that you've got a couple of factors. I think that the campaign for political participation has gone on for much longer in the African American community, but it's more than that. It's also, I think, the civil society structures that exist, the church, social organizations, the historically black colleges and universities, all of which provide a kind of foundation for participation in life, in public life. Some of them are private, the HBCUs, some of them are private, some of them are public. But they became in the civil rights movement a foundation for political action, where people left their classrooms and began to sit in on lunch counters and to organize participation, voter registration, campaigns. The Latino community, there now are Hispanics serving institutions of higher education, but they're relatively new. The HBCUs are many of them are traced their origins back to the late 19th century, and are also linked to churches. So you have a kind of double whammy of church and educational institution, and that people have a tremendous loyalty to. And so what I'm saying about these institutions is they provide a kind of a civil society, a civic participation basis. The other groups are new to the educational aspect, but it's also, so then I'll change the focus to the ways in which the society socialized the African American population. Slavery, segregation, discrimination. Several hundred years of slavery, small proportions of the population not being enslaved, but still being subject to it and being in jeopardy all the time. Post-slavery, post-Civil War, shortly after, by 1896, de jure segregation comes into recognition by the Supreme Court. And so you go from 1896 through basically 1954 to 1965, or put it in that time frame, and you've got all of that time for framing African American communities as being to be segregated, to be corralled. But it meant that people had to create new generations of institutions. The NAACP, the Urban League, these all come into existence in the early periods of that, the early years of segregation. And a lot of the social organizations get created in that period of time as well. So it creates a kind of political participation foundation. It creates a sense of self as being excluded, but people transform that into a basis for understanding what they had to do in order to be able to be independent. The Latino population, people were either in the Southwest already, with some numbers of people coming in from time to time, but not being a formal segregation in the same way. Yes, it did have some impact, but it didn't have this kind of national institutionalized sense of self. And it's more recently, I would think in the 1960s and 70s, that you start to see the brown power emphasis among Latinos. or Chicanos. The ways in which the name changed, they self-defined. And then also you have the multiple groups speaking the same language but being from different national origins. The Puerto Ricans from the U.S. but in Ireland, Mexican Americans, Cubans, and so that group has begun to be more assimilated with each other than was the case. The African American population was basically assimilated for all those centuries in slavery. Asian Americans, national populations arriving, not even at different languages, not necessarily seeing themselves as part of the same group. America presents that you're to be seen as one group approach to people. So I think that it's the differences in experiences. I haven't mentioned Native Americans, obviously present with interesting and contradictory ways in which they participate and relate to the national U.S. with the legal status as sovereign nations, but yet also they became citizens in the 1920s, 1925. And so there's a contradiction of, yes, they get to vote, except they're not permitted to vote. Yes, they're sovereign nations in relation to the U.S., but they're also participants. And so they tend not to, because of the tribal status, they tend to enter in terms of state legislative representation, not so much at the national level, and the local level is tribal organization and self-governance. So you've got very different structures of histories in the U.S., arrival, how the communities are structured, and that produces, I would argue, very different patterns. So in terms of African American women, for example, they've been in churches for hundreds of years. They've been in social and other kinds of civic organizations. And the other groups are either not present. In the case of the Asian American population, a very small proportion of people are Chinese, but not the Japanese, not the Filipino, not the Vietnamese or the Cambodians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it creates a really different set of structures and patterns of participation.